today without any incident.
Iran has been ready for cooperation with the IAEA to remove the ambiguities. During our time, you remember, in 2003 to 2005, we implemented additional protocol. We implemented subsidiary arrangement code 3.1. We even suspended the enrichment. We gave access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. We opened the military sites to the IAEA. But the EU3 was not able to recognize the legitimate rights of Iran because the US position was zero enrichment. That's why negotiations during our time failed, despite the fact we were ready for full transparency, and we proved practically. During President Ahmadinejad, Russia in 2011 proposed a step-by-step plan. The Russian step-by-step plan consisted of all major requirements of the IAEA, Atomic Energy Agency, and United Nations Security Council resolutions, and even beyond. But Iranian officials, they welcomed the Russian initiative as a base for negotiations. It was the US and the Europe which declined the Russian proposal. Therefore, I believe, again, even today, the Russian proposal can be a good base for negotiations.
You personally worked with IAEA monitors in Iran for several years, and well, the international observers are known to have accused Iran of not letting them see everything they want, while Tehran has been saying that it can't satisfy all of their demands. Who is right?
It depends. Iran is a member of Safeguard. They are asking Iran to implement additional protocol. Implementing additional protocol is not mandatory for the nations, for the countries. Today, 70 countries, they do not implement additional protocol. Therefore, this would be a gesture, a goodwill from Iran to implement additional protocol. The IAEA is even requesting Iran to give access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. No nation in this world has given access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. I believe Iran is ready. If they recognize the rights of Iran for enrichment like any other member of NPT, and if they are prepared ultimately to lift the sanctions, to start lifting the sanctions gradually, at the end state to lift all sanctions. If the West and the P5+1 are ready on these two issues, I believe Iran would show goodwill to accept additional protocol, to cooperate with the IAEA on possible military dimension issues, which would need to give access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol.
Buildup is in the works. Thousands of U.S. troops now gearing up to go to Israel. The military is calling it an exercise, not a deployment. But this is one serious exercise. This, as Israel says, they're ready to go to war with Iran. So what's really going on here? Jamal Abdi is in studio to dig deeper into this. Welcome, Jamal. So the U.S. is tightening ties with Israel. What is happening?
Well, what is happening on its face is that the U.S. is working to reassure Israel, to reassure Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states that we have their backs, that we have this security blanket in the region, and that they don't have to worry about Iran as a threat. But as we can see, we're getting closer and closer to war with Iran. Anybody who argues that this, kind of extraordinary confluence of events, the planned exercises by the U.S. and Israel, the exercises that Iran was doing in the Persian Gulf, anybody that argues that those aren't sort of part of a lead up to eventual military confrontation, I think is probably running out of arguments at this point. And the reason that this is happening is that this is the logical conclusion of our current strategy against Iran. We have sanctions in place with no diplomacy. The only way that that ends is through confrontation.
They are calling this particular buildup an exercise and not a deployment. But is there more to it?
Well, this is something that has been planned for quite a while now. It's not the first time that this sort of exercise has been done with Israel. But what is being planned is actually, back in September, the U.S. actually provided Israel with an advanced radar, and for the first time actually permanently deployed U.S. troops to Israel. That was a small contingent, though, of a couple hundred troops. What we see now, though, is this much larger exercise, not unprecedented, but definitely something that is going to have an impact right now as we see this sort of tit-for-tat in confrontation between the U.S. and Iran.
So we are seeing a lot in that region, as you just mentioned, this permanent presence, and now this massive military exercise.
Yeah, and this is to set up, this is for a contingency plan, but I would argue that this is a contingency plan that we're going to see enacted if we don't find a way to change course. The idea is that were there to be a massive war in the Middle East, presumably with Iran, that we would be ready to have set up command within Israel and actually have Israel set up a command center in Europe at the U.S. European Command.
And Israel at this point seems both ready and willing to go to war with Iran. So if they do, will the U.S. automatically join them?
Well, that's the funny thing. Some have said that the Obama administration believes that it could distance itself from an Israeli strike on Iran. And there have been these sort of public leaks in which U.S. officials have said Israel wouldn't notify us until jets were scrambled and in the air before they struck Iran. But that being said, given that we're doing this massive military exercise, given that the U.S. has actually, under Obama in 2009, actually provided Israel with these bunker busters that presumably would be used against Iranian nuclear facilities, I think it's going to be very difficult to not be implicated, for the U.S. not to be implicated in an Israeli strike on Iran. And so I don't see a scenario in which this happens and we are not forced into some sort of all-out war.
So you're saying the likelihood is if Israel goes, the U.S. will go?
Absolutely. And Iranian officials have said this. They're going to consider any strike by Israel a strike by the United States.
Now, this huge buildup is happening as President Obama just today announced that there's supposed to be this big reduction in military spending. And in order to do that, he's bringing the troops home from Iraq, from Afghanistan. But now we're seeing this possible military conflict with Iran. So is it possible that this isn't really much of a drawdown or a shrinking of military, but just a redirecting of resources?
Well, you'll recall that under Bush, we didn't consider the Iraq or Afghanistan wars as military spending. They were a separate budget item. And I would argue that you can't actually reduce military spending unless we actually have a strategic realignment that puts more of a focus on diplomacy. We can't continue the policies of the Bush administration and of previous administrations when it comes to Iran, policies that can only end in military confrontation. If we don't change those, we're going to end up spending the money that previous administrations would have spent on a war. We're locked into this trajectory.
One method that the U.S. is using are these sanctions, but some argue that these sanctions are in themselves an act of war.
Well, Iran has said that they would consider sanctions on their oil exports and sanctions on their central bank an act of war. I think it could be reasonably argued that the covert attacks within Iran, and frankly, some of the things that Iran does could all be considered acts of war, and that there is a Cold War going on. There's also an economic war going on against Iran. So I think that we do have a low-scale war right now, and the question is, does that actually escalate out of control into a full-scale war? And I'll say that, what's happening now with Iran, people are calling it desperation. They're saying that what's happening is actually a sign that the sanctions are working. But I think that begs the question, what are the sanctions intended to do? if they're working to bring us closer to war, then absolutely they are working.
This isn't just about nuclear weapons. If it were about nuclear weapons in the Middle East, then the United States would have a bone to pick with Israel, which is the only power in the Middle East which actually possesses nuclear weapons. It's not about that. That's the casus belli. But the reason for this continued conflict is because the American administration simply can't live with an Iran which has as much regional power as it has at the moment. You see, the Americans, when they look at the Iranian regime, they see its links with Syria, they see its links with Hamas, they see its links with Hezbollah, and this is a challenge to American power in an absolutely critical, economically critical, geopolitically critical area of the globe, and it's that which is the sticking point for the American administration, in my view.
Just briefly, how bad could this get? We're hearing now the UK supported Washington's rhetoric, saying its warships are at the ready to prevent any attempt by Iran to hinder trade through that crucial Strait of Hormuz. Could this go further, do you think, develop into actual warfare?
Well, I think this is certainly in the minds of some of the players in the international community. We know that Israel, for instance, has had test flights out into the Mediterranean for exactly the same distance as there is between Tel Aviv and Tehran, with a view to having a strike on the nuclear facilities. And we know that even the Bush administration in its last months had to restrain the state of Israel from doing this. So we know that there are some people, hawks in Israel, hawks in the United States, who want to settle this militarily. And it does seem to me that once we begin on the process of implementing sanctions, of Iran responding to the sanctions, that there will be calls further down the road for a direct military conflict. And that, in this case, is even more dangerous than it was in the case of Iraq.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that. But I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. Of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
The whole world is saying Iran violate UN Security Council resolutions. They're continuing to race towards the development of nuclear bombs.
Canada has sparked international reaction after shutting its embassy in Tehran and pulling out all of its diplomats. The government says one of the reasons was that it feared for their safety, but that the move goes far beyond the staff in Tehran. According to Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird on Friday, Iran isn't just a threat to Canadian diplomats.
Canada views the government of Iran as the most significant threat to global peace and security in the world today.
For Baird, Iran is a global menace, and he's not alone.
Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability presents an intolerable threat to Israel, to America, and to the world.
We remain deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear program.
Right now, the biggest threat we're all facing is Iran's plans to develop nuclear weapons capability.
World leaders have repeatedly warned that they are willing to do anything to prevent Iran from getting the bomb.